Welcome everyone to the Margaret Maher Award for the Amherst Irish Association. We were formed in 2014 out of an unfortunate series of events here in Amherst when we were just not at all happy with the way Ireland or Irish people were being represented or our hometown. And so we decided to do something positive with that negative feeling. And so we started this organization, and we've been presenting every year then a series of events with great speakers. And what was it, 4 years ago, we started an annual Margaret Maher Award. And Margaret Maher was a domestic servant in the Emily Dickinson household for 30 years. And her spirit really speaks to what our mission is. So we're really pleased to have this event today. And I would also like to, at this time, thank the Immigrant Support Program of the Irish government, without whose help we would not be able to do what we do. We rely on them to publicize our events, and we're so grateful to them for that help. And with that, I'll pass it on over to Ida O'Carroll.
Thank you, Sam. Agus fáilte isteach ach aine. Welcome everybody to this important event on Colúidir Iontach, Lá Iontach, Ceiliúradh Atáirsúil, a time of celebration, Ceiliúradh. And I wanted to begin by just filling you in a little bit about Margaret Maher, and then make a connection to our presentation today. And after I speak, then our esteemed Consul General Laoise Moore, Ireland's representative in Boston, will formally present virtually the Margaret Maher Award for this year. So bear with me, and I'll give you a little bit of info on Margaret Maher and why we've hitched our wagon to her, so to speak. So Margaret Maher, or Maggie as she was called, was born in Killusty, County Tipperary in 1821, and she died in the town of Amherst in 1924. She was an Irish immigrant, and as Sam said, spent over 30 years working as a domestic servant in the Dickinson household, became very close to the poet Emily Dickinson. She came to Amherst around 1855. So she would have come after the Daley and Halligan execution that we'll be hearing more about today. And I wondered when we were preparing for this event, what she knew about that event then. But in her book, Aoife Murray's book, Made as Muse, she argues that Maggie Maher had a huge influence on Emily Dickinson's poetry, and that the kind of Hiberno English, or Margaret's brogue, as we might call it, influenced Emily Dickinson's poetry. So Maggie Maher's connection to Amherst and to the poet Emily Dickinson is an important one. And Aoife Murray also argues that Emily's poems, copies of them, were to be destroyed, and it was Maggie Maher who kept them in her trunk, the trunk she used to travel to America. And so we can attribute our access to the poet Emily Dickinson's work to the smart thinking Maggie Maher, who decided to preserve them and keep them safe for posterity. Initially, when we were thinking about the Margaret Maher Award, we set up an essay competition so that the community in our wider Pioneer Valley area could write about Ireland and what interests them. And the thinking was that it would give us an idea of the sort of topics people might like to see in the programme. Then we changed last year and decided that there were several people within our community who had been flying the flag for Irish history, culture and heritage for years. And it was time that we recognised them and that we had the capacity to do that. And so our first awardee was last year. It was Rosemary Kane, a noted musician, composer, and someone who's been tirelessly promoting Ireland and Irish culture in the Pioneer Valley. Rosie is actually currently working on a musical based on the life of Maggie Maher. So there are incredible connections happening as we meet today. Now to our two awardees. Bill O'Riordan first invited us as our little association to join them on St. Patrick's Day at the Daley and Halligan Memorial. We were delighted to do so. And it was there we also met Mike Ryan, and Mike and Judy invited us to their home to look at his collection of Irish literary and historical pieces of ephemera and so forth. And Mike presented in our Amherst Irish series in 2018. As Mike said to us when we met him, he said, I know the Amherst Irish isn't all about shamrocks and shillelaghs, and isn't that the truth? In fact, our Twitter hashtag is beyond Blarney. So we do try and go a little bit beyond the shamrocks and shillelaghs. Mike and Bill's lifelong efforts to keep Irish history alive in this area demonstrates a desire to seek a deeper understanding of Ireland and to pass on an appreciation of Irish history and culture to the people within our wider community. By establishing the Daley and Halligan Memorial to two immigrants wrongfully executed in 1806 and organising an annual gathering at the site on St. Patrick's Day, Bill and Mike want us to remember that anti-immigrant sentiment is nothing new in America, unfortunately. Through their work, we learned that Daley and Halligan experienced in the 19th century what often immigrants today experience in the United States. I now hand you over to Laoise Moore, Consul General of Ireland, Boston, the Irish government's representative in our area, so that she may formally present the award. Guramila Mahagat Galer, Guramila Mahagat Laoise, and thank you so much for agreeing to present the award. Laoise Moore.
Ida, thank you so much for having me, and it's such a pleasure to be meeting with you all once again over Zoom, and I do hope it's not going to be too long before I get to visit the beautiful area of Amherst and the Amherst Irish Association again in person. So as Ireland's Consul General in New England, it is a very great honour for me to once again be presenting the Margaret Maher Award, and the 2021 award goes to, as Ida has outlined, two very deserving recipients, Mike Ryan and Bill O'Riordan, in recognition of their very long-standing commitment to Irish history and culture and heritage, as Ida has alluded to, but also in particular their instrumental work in establishing a permanent memorial to two Irish immigrants, Dominic Daley and James Halligan, who were executed in 1806 for a murder that they didn't commit. Today, I'm not sure if you're aware, but today, the 10th of October, is actually World Day Against the Death Penalty. And Ireland, as you may know, is against the death penalty along with the rest of the EU. So as Ireland's Consul General in Boston, it feels particularly fitting for me, and I'm particularly honoured to present this award in recognition of the work that Mike Ryan and Bill O'Riordan have done to ensure that we have not forgotten, and we do not forget these two Irish immigrants who were hanged for a crime that they did not commit. So it is my very great honour to join you and to present this award to two very deserving recipients. Córa agus míle buíochas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laoise. Guramila Míle Mahagat. And lads, if you have your awards, would you just put them up in front of the screen so we can see? I'll just add a little word that the awards were crafted from local wood by one of our musicians. His name is Al Ladd. He's one of our regular musicians. And it's a Bridget's Cross, which is the logo of our association. And of course, our deserving recipients, Mike and Bill, will now give us a background to their work and to the memorial itself. Take it away, lads.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. My name is Bill O'Riordan, and Mike here is on my right, and we have been involved in this for quite some time. And I'm going to give you some introductory remarks, and then Mike will take over in regards to the actual meat and potatoes part of this whole trial and who Halligan and Daley were. And he's the expert on this, and I will only take up a few minutes and add a few things later. I want to thank the Amherst Irish Association. We're honored and humbled by the award, and we appreciate our association with you, both on St. Patrick's Day and the times we come over for the great presentations that you put out. Halligan and Daley is a simple but tragic story of two unfortunate souls who were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was 1805. They were traveling to New York from Boston on foot. A murder occurred in Wilbraham, and they had passed by that place a little bit earlier on their travels. All because they were strangers. They were soon accused, apprehended, arrested, tried, and executed in Northampton. All because the fact, again, that they were strangers. They spoke different, looked different, and worshiped different. Two recent Irish immigrants. Basic information on that story, however, we will go into much more detail. It is our hope that by continuing to memorialize these men, the truth will be known, and with agencies and associations and so forth helping us out over the last 50 years, I think we've been doing it. We've been able to get this story told in many different places. We have both learned at an early age about the stories in the same way. Both of our fathers, who were very devout individuals, would always tip their hats to the Catholic churches when they drove around Northampton. But we noticed when we were kids, when we were in the car, that they also tipped it to the Halligan and Daley Monument. And obviously that put an impression on us and as young kids, and then we learned as years go on. And Mike and I told that story to each other. It's kind of interesting because it happened to both of us. As years went on, we soon became dedicated to the story. And as the Halligan Daley story is an Irish Catholic story, we are pleased that it's become more ecumenical, that the First Church and the Edwards Church in Northampton had become involved a few years back with some of our projects and some of our speaking engagements and so forth. Also, and these are the things that we'd hoped we could accomplish. It's a little list here. It's a Northampton story, but again, like your association and like the Ancient Order of Hibernians in Holyoke, other towns are being involved and supporting us. And finally, it's a story that is passed on through generations. We learned through our generation, I mean, our parents, and from older people in Northampton that had done this before, and then we kind of took the torch and went from there. But every year, and I think that anyone who's come to the monument on St. Patrick's Day knows that the youngest lays the wreath that we plant every year. Mm-hmm. Now, every year it seems to be the youngest needs help, because sometimes it's a 9-month-old baby, sometimes it's a, but next year we've got another baby, and Tony Ryan, who will be helping us here, is a grandfather, and he's already called me and says, my granddaughter is going to be laying the wreath next year. So we would be remiss if we didn't mention our families and help the candle burning, and also the District Attorney Dave Sullivan, who helped spearhead a 200-year anniversary celebration in 2005 that really brought the story out. John Carlin, a retired firefighter who gained exoneration from Governor Dukakis for Halligan and Daley. The Sheriff's Department, and that's important because the Sheriff's Department keeps that property clean. They mow it and they rake it and they keep it together under Bob Garvey, the Amherst man, and now under Patrick Lane, and they've been very helpful in that respect. And we can't not mention the fact that we were able to get this together. We're not very technical. Tony Ryan, brother and friend, who works tirelessly for his technical and photographic skills to capture the history of Halligan and Daley. There's also a book about it. It's historical fiction, so it's a little careful what's in the book, but there's a book about it. There's a play, there's an opera, and there's been poems and songs. The only thing we don't have is a motion picture at this point, and we're hoping at some point someone will write a screenplay. Finally, our objective is, as it was mentioned earlier, is to teach a lesson on how they were treated, because who they were and not let this happen again to others. I'm going to drop out here and let Mike say his piece, and I'm sure it'll become interesting, and I'm interested no matter how many times I hear it. Thank you.
Thank you, Billy. And thank you for the short interruption. I understand our time is now up, so we'll listen to questions. In any event, I'd like to add one more that I would like to say thank you to, and just tell a short story. Back in 1978, a fellow from Amherst, Bob Garvey, decided to run for county commissioner. And Bill and I both supported him. And we were both surprised when we received his what he was sending out, a little detail of who he was. And at the back of it, he said he was a descendant, the great grandson of one-armed Tommy Kelly?
Yes, Kelly.
One-armed Tommy Kelly, who it turns out was the brother-in-law of Maggie Maher. And he married Maggie's sister, and Maggie lived with them, the two of them, her entire life. So it doesn't go far, but we were both surprised, shocked, and very pleased that this fellow from Amherst running for county commissioner was using the name of his great-grandfather, and it got him a lot of support in Northampton. So I want to salute one-armed Tom Kelly too, and for the work that he did for the Irish, and I like to see his memory kept alive also. Well, my role here today is to tell why Daley and Halligan, what evidence there is that they were innocent. This has gone on for a long, long time. And when I say a long time, it was when Daley and Halligan were arrested and this murder took place. First of all, it was an extraordinary event in that it had never happened before. It was the first time in a small town in New England that somebody had been killed by strangers or were robbed on the highway while they were on a road. It had happened sometimes in the big cities, but it never happened in a small town. And I have a collection somewhere that I recently saw of 118 newspaper articles that were written about Daley and Halligan murdering Marcus. And this is within a couple months of the murder itself and long before the trial took place. In fact, so it was an extraordinary event. It was well known to everyone, and it continued to remain in the news for several years. It was usually brought up as an example of why foreigners should not be allowed into the country and why they should not be allowed to become citizens. It was used by anti-Irish as an example of what happens if you let Irishmen into the country. It remained in that status until the late 1860s, 1870s, as the Irish came in. They had other people they could blame, but the Daley and Halligan sort of dropped out. And it became very popular for people who were anti-death penalty to begin to use Daley and Halligan as an example of innocent people who were wrongly executed. These two stories, the one of they're terrible Irish and shouldn't be allowed in the country, and they're an example of innocent people being executed, became sort of a competitive story by different parties with different issues, and remained that way up until probably the 1970s and 1980s. And it changed when more and more Irish writers, Catholic writers, began to look at the story of Daley and Halligan and raise issues that had never been raised before. There were several interesting things, and I want to start to go over them, of what made this different and the prosecution different. To begin with, it all happened on the ninth day of, oh gosh, the next to the last day of the year,
November.
of the 9th day of November in 1805. Marcus Lyons had worked for a year with his brother-in-law in New York and was on his way back to Connecticut, where he lived. The story was, and it seems to be true, that he was on his way back to marry his girlfriend and then to continue back to go back to Cazenovia, New York, where he had worked a year. When he was delivering letters to different people throughout the pathway home, and he was carrying some when he went through Western Massachusetts. At the same time he was coming from the west to the east, our fellows were going from the east to the west. Daley and Halligan were both living in Boston at the time. Daley was a married man. His mother and his wife lived in Boston with him, and he had a 1 or 2 year old child. He was 34 years old. Halligan was a little bit younger. He was 28. He actually had spent some time in Connecticut, in Hartford, Connecticut. And when he was charged with murder, the people in Hartford, Connecticut wrote letters and about how shocked they were that such a delightful and polite and hardworking young man could be resort to such behavior. They didn't question what he did, but they created a different personality and spoke high praise of him when he was among them. What was also interesting was his horse was found. Incidentally, he had a very wealthy horse and with a good equipment all over it, very wealthy, and that was noted by many of the witnesses. The reason was because his father died when he was young, and he had just come into his inheritance about a year early. He was about 22, maybe 23 when he died, when he was killed. But so for a young fellow, he had a pretty good horse, and he had some pretty good equipment that with the horse. It was enough so it caught a lot of people's attention. Many people saw him go by. He was last seen about, many people claim that he was last seen at 1 o'clock. I'll come to that a little bit later. But in any event, Daley and Halligan came through about the same area about 2 o'clock. And they continued through. They went to Springfield, then down to Hartford. They got down to someplace down in southern Connecticut, where they were going to catch a boat to New York, when they were apprehended by people who were chasing him. It turns out that after he had gone, his horse was found running loose. This raised people's attention. They thought at first that it was probably a doctor who had a habit of letting his dog run free while he was seeing patients. But when it didn't, no one came for it by the end of Saturday. On Sunday morning, particularly as people went to church, they began to talk about it. And it became known that there were 2 Irishmen who were walking through the territory about the same time. As soon as they connected a missing person with 2 Irishmen, they began to say that he must have been murdered and to start talking about a crime being committed. It was Sunday night when they did discover the body. They had already set up a meeting to have to get warrants for these two Irishmen who had gone by. And as a matter of fact, even before the warrant was issued, or even before Daley, they looked into what caused the death of the person. They had a warrant for the two Irishmen had gone and had set people after them. In any event, the body was found in water that was about maybe they said that they measured it differently than I would measure it, but it was probably about a quarter of a mile from where the highway that it was on begins. It was the person who was in charge of the passway to the turnpike. He was it was part of his job to collect money for people who were starting to take the path. He immediately, and Sunday afternoon, in the afternoon, they began to search for the body. It was later that night, still before the body was found, but there had been evidence found of broken weapons found, and the owner of the person in charge of the turnpike, his son, came forward and said, "Gee, I forgot to mention, but yesterday I saw two fellows, I think they were the Irishmen, and they had a horse that they were holding on to, and eventually one of them drove it up the road to where the horse was eventually found." It's remarkable, of course, that he didn't mention it to his father, who was out looking for the driver of the horse, that he never mentioned he saw a witness, but that's in any event when he brought it up. And he stated that this took place at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. When the body was found, they had an inquest. And interestingly, at the inquest, there were two or three, the boy testified that it was 1 o'clock. He went into some substantial detail of what he saw, what he observed, how they had the horse, how they seemed hostile, how they seemed to be very concerned about his seeing them. He went through great detail about it, insisted it was 1 o'clock, explained how it was. And then as they called people to testify, two of the people got up and testified that they saw the deceased person, Marcus Lyons, drive by at 2 o'clock. One of them said he stopped and he talked to him and he was certain it was 2 o'clock. Now, that in itself acquits Daley and Halligan, who were out of town by 2 o'clock, were away from the scene. And in fact, there was testimony put in that Marcus Lyons was still alive at 2 o'clock. Those two people were named Griffin Bailey and Elijah Shepherd. Griffin was in front of Elijah's house when the man went by on the bike, or on his horse. They stopped and talked to him. And then Griffin talked a little bit to Shepherd and then went on his way. Both of them said it was 2 o'clock when that conversation took place. This is in the same meeting, the young fellow explained that it was 1 o'clock when he saw them taking the horse, which of course that was evidence that he had already been, that the murder had already been committed and that the horse was taken away from him. Clearly something was wrong there. Something was wrong. When it came into any event, Daley and Halligan were arrested in Cove, Connecticut. They voluntarily came back. They talked about their trip, where they went, how they traveled. They weren't one bit frightened by it, but they thought that they would get up, they'd explain what happened, and everything would be taken care of. As we know, it didn't turn out that way, but they were very cooperative when they were stopped. They volunteered to leave Connecticut. They had a right to a hearing, but they turned that down and came back willingly. 2 days later, they had conducted a preliminary hearing to see if there was grounds to hold them. At that time, things changed a little bit. Elijah Shepherd, who saw the deceased at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, was not called to testify. Griffin Bailey was called to testify. He too said he had seen him alive at 2 o'clock, but he changed his time to seeing him alive until shortly after noon. He took 2 hours off of his testimony. As it turned out, when it came to trial, Griffin Bailey continued to say that it took place at 1 o'clock, or between noon and 1 o'clock. And we never heard of Elijah Shepherd again. I did, when I was doing some research on it, however, look it up, and I went to Wilbraham, did some research, and found that Shepherd was still alive when he was not called to testify. So the boys were, I call them the boys. I apologize for that. They were 27 and 35, but they were always called by their enemies. They were always called the boys, rather than giving them credit for being adults. I've been reading a lot of it in preparation for this, and I noticed it, and I guess I picked it up a little, so I take it back. They were adult men and responsible men. In any event, when the trial came in, it came in the month of April 25th, I think it began. The government did right by them by giving them lawyers to represent them. They each had 2. There's some things that should be mentioned. One, the lawyers were not appointed to represent them until 2 days before the trial began. And secondly, they each had 2 lawyers, but among the 4 of them, no one had ever represented anybody in a murder case or in a case that if convicted, a person could be executed. They did not have that kind of experience. Now granted, there were not an awful lot of murder trials. That's not unusual, but 3 of the 4 had never appeared in the higher courts of Massachusetts. They were lawyers, but in those days, a lot of lawyers were part-time, and at least 2 of the 4 lawyers were not part-time, were not full-time. And the third, one of those who was Thomas Gold. Thomas Gold was the nephew of one of the presiding judges. There were 2 presiding judges. It was Samuel Seward and Thomas Sedgwick. Sedgwick was well known for his vehement anti-working class people. And he had at one time, a few years earlier, had the Catholic priests appear before him for marrying somebody. Catholic priests were not allowed to marry people at the time. This priest had conducted a wedding of 2 members of his parish. He was prosecuted for it. He was fined and summoned. He wasn't incarcerated, but he was warned that if he did such a thing again, he would be incarcerated. He was Sedgwick was the judge who heard that, who made that decision, and now he was going to be the trial attorney for Daley and Halligan. He made 2 rulings in there that, again, show his bias. The defense attorneys had evidence they wished to produce showing that that area where that murder took place had been frequently used to rob trains or rob stagecoaches. They had no trains at the time, but they had evidence that other types of crimes had taken place there, and that particularly travelers going through usually would wait for somebody else to join them so they could go in company. No one wanted to go alone through that particular area. The judge, in making the ruling that that could not be introduced in evidence, said that it was not relevant. And then added, in front of the jury, he added, now, if I allowed that type of evidence, I could also allow evidence of the past crimes of Daley and Halligan. Well, Daley and Halligan had no record of committing any crimes or never doing anything illegal, but the suggestion was put there before the jury. Obviously, it's prejudicial and should not have been said or allowed. They also did other things that the prosecutors did that they knew would prejudice the jury, but would not be allowed in as evidence. One, they brought two men from Boston who came and said, about a month before the murder, an Irishman came into our store. They sold clothing and other items. That the man made a few purchases and then asked if they had any weapons. And they were surprised to hear that, because he was an Irishman, and usually a working Irishman, and that usually working people didn't buy guns. So he was very suspicious. When asked if he could identify the person who bought the guns, he said no, he couldn't identify him. He had a companion with him who was also working that day. He remembered the Irishman buying guns, but no, he couldn't identify either of the people as the person who purchased the weapons. So that evidence does get thrown out, but at the same time, the jury has already heard that there were Irishmen from the same place, the same city that these fellows were, who had purchased guns. Oh, and the guns he couldn't identify either as being the guns that they sold, but they did say they're very similar. So you have some unknown person who may or may not be of Irish, but say he is of Irish, who purchased a weapon that was similar to the weapon that was used, but nobody could identify them as that person. They also, it was first announced that it was, one of the things that made it such a terrible crime was that Marcus was carrying such little money with him, it was hardly worth it for them to rob someone such as him. But they, as it turns out, I forget which one, I'm sorry, but one of the men of our men, Daley or Halligan, was carrying a substantial amount of money. And the brother-in-law of Marcus Lyons, with whom Marcus had been living with for a year in Cazenovia, New York, he took the stand and said that money that was in, let's say it was Daley's pocket, I think it was, that Daley was carrying was the same money that my son-in-law had when he left my house. And I sent a letter to the sheriff telling him what bills he had in his pocket. Well, it turned out no letter, such letter had been sent. The money that was he had, he was carrying, all of it came from the Boston area. None of it came from New York. And there was just no indication at all that he had anything to do with that money. Earlier it had said that he had no such money. And so of course it was suppressed. It was, the jury could not consider it as evidence, and yet it did. It was there that his brother-in-law was saying that that money came from him. The final thing I'd like to say is the child who said, "I saw him at 1 o'clock with the horse." He spoke 3 times. He spoke the first time to for the warrant, when they were working on the warrant. The second time to see if he should be bound over, and the third time he spoke was the trial. He told 3 different stories about what he was doing out there. One, he said he was out there to fetch some animals. Later, he said he was bringing some animals to put them in the woods where they could feed. Once he said that when he saw him, he ran away from him. The other time he said that when they started to look at him, he went over and took some fruit from a tree that he began to eat, and then casually walked away. The other time he said he ran away. But the biggest thing that he changed was the day that he testified. And when they had come home, he identified one of the men as to somebody he saw with the horse. When they came home, when he testified the final day at the trial, he said that they said, "Where did you see him?" And he says, well, they walked by me at my father's house. I'm not quoting these people, but the tone, the sense of what they said is he was at his father's house where they collected the money for using the road. He saw the men walk by, and then he said 5 minutes later, he went into down and he saw them in the woods, coming out of the woods with the horse. That gave him 5 minutes to commit the murder. Marcus Lyons was shot. His ribs were broken. He fell from his horse. Somebody went over and smashed in his skull and then dragged him down and put him in the water. The idea that this could be accomplished in 15 minutes is insane. The last thing I want to point out also is if you crash somebody's skull like there will be blood all over your hands, all over your clothing. If you drag them into the water, your clothing is going to be wet. The body was placed in water that was 2 feet deep. They would be drenched with water, and if they had carried the body in there, they'd be covered with blood if they had murdered him. There were 9 people who testified that after the time of the murder, they were seen running or walking very, very quickly. They were people that were spread over 11 miles, talked about how fast they saw them walking. Not a single person said that they were wet. Not a single person said that they noticed any blood. Not a single person said that they were dirty or wet from going into the water. Those are quickly and in summary, the things that they were charged with, the things that show that there was no possible way that they could have committed that. In one of the projects that was done before they received their pardon from Governor Dukakis, he asked a detective, a police detective, to look at the facts of the case and see if he would see probable cause there. The person who did this investigation found it absolutely ridiculous that what the boy described could be done in 5 or 10, 15 minutes, that he wouldn't be covered with water, he wouldn't be covered with blood, that it would just no way in the world, and that no reasonable person who had detective work would ever bring charges against these 2 young men. That, in summary, is the weakness of the case against Daley and Halligan. But given the fact that they were Irish, given the fact that they were Catholic, there was nobody, not one of the 15,000 people who watched them hang, had any doubt of their guilt except the priest who was there to minister to them on that day. So I leave it with that. You think of those facts and think of the idea of people being convicted and executed because of them. You'll know why Billy and I have been harping on this for 50 years. Thank you again. I too want to thank everyone for the award that I received, for the attention you've given to Daley and Halligan. The last thing I want to say is we do talk Daley and Halligan all the time. We speak of it, but we have also in what we've done is remember Marcus Lyon, who was the victim of a horrible crime. The fact that two people who were innocent of it were convicted and sentenced also means that the person who did beat him and murder him in that terrible way has walked away free. And he should not be forgotten either. He was a true victim.
As they were about to be executed, the last dying words of Dominic, Daley, and James Halligan, at this awful moment of appearing before the tribunal of the Almighty and knowing that telling a falsehood would be eternal perdition to our poor souls, we solemnly declare we are perfectly innocent of the crime for which we suffer or any other murder or robbery. Never saw, to our knowledge, Marcus Lyons in our life, and as unaccountable as may appear, the boy never saw one of us looking at him or near a fence, or any of us either leading, driving, or riding a horse. We never went off the high road. We blame no one. We forgive everybody. We submit to our fate as being the will of the Almighty and beg him to be merciful to us through the merits of his divine Son, our blessed Savior. Our sincere thanks to Reverend John Chevers for his long and kind attention, and likewise every other friend that served us and comforted us during this long confinement. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Mike and Bill. I think what we wanted to do was to open up the space for questions. And since not everybody knows how to use the chat function on Zoom, might I suggest that you raise your hand in your screen if you have a question, and Tim can unmute you and so you can ask. So Tim will see if your hand is up. Can you raise your hand if you have a question for Bill or Mike?
Am I unmuted?
You're
there you
fine,
go.
Margaret.
Go ahead. Okay, Michael, you mentioned that someone on his deathbed confessed to the killings.
Yeah.
How come you didn't mention that?
I'm not sure that happened.
Oh.
I've never been, I think there's a good possibility, but it was 15 years or 50 years later that it was first mentioned. It was mentioned by a Catholic priest who certainly himself didn't hear it, but he reported that he heard it, and then he went to speak to the person who was the sheriff at the time, and said that person also admitted that he heard it. I have never found anything to support it. I'm looking, I keep looking. It's certainly, I know the governor can put it in his list. There are other things I think are stronger. And so I usually don't mention that as one of the things that I see as weaknesses in the case.
We use it sometimes at opportune times, but not before an audience where we're supposed to be telling the truth.
Okay, I see another hand, Tim. Go ahead.
Did anybody at the time think that there was a miscarriage of justice? Did anybody in Boston legal system that was there at the time?
I know that the priests that they called in thought they were innocent his entire life. There was one article that was written by a newspaper in Vermont that raised the idea that the evidence seemed circumstantial. it went both ways, but it did suggest that there was evidence. But almost other than that, the answer is no. I don't know of anybody in the system who thought there was anything wrong at all. And have you ever?
No.
No.
Okay.
They became more innocent as more Irish immigrants came and researched it, as Mike had mentioned. But they were pretty much considered guilty until Irish became the immigration started after 1840, 1860s.
And I think Leisha, did you have your hand up there? Tim, can you see?
Yeah, I did. And I think you've actually just answered my question, because I was curious to know, when did people start to recognize this as a miscarriage of justice? I think you just answered. So was it around sort of like 1840, and after that when more Irish came and then more people began to question that?
Yeah, it was about 1840 that it first began to raise, and was first raised by Catholics, Irish Catholics. As I said, it was taken up almost about the 1870s, when people began to be anti-death penalty. They seem to have grabbed hold of it without stating a lot of reasons. It was just sort of an assumption, their belief that it was innocence. And I haven't been able to find what they referred to when they did it, but there were a couple of those organizations that spoke as if they were innocent.
I see Rosie has her hand up. Our last year's 2020 Margaret Maher Awardee. Tim? There she is.
I just wondered if any of the descendants, because at least one of them had children, right? I've got that right, have I?
Yes.
Daley had children. Dominic Daley.
So I'm just wondering if the story came down the pipeline of the generations, and if anybody had any contact, or there was a sense of the outrage, in the successive generations, who might have been inspired to be activists, on behalf of eliminating the death. I just wondered if there was any connection between present day descendants and how that filtered down through the family.
Daley, there is some references that we were able to find about Daley's mother, who received support from what's the name of the Boston? They're still active. The Irish.
The Irish Charitable Irish. It's an organization from the 1700s. Yeah, the late 1700s.
Yes, correct. Yeah, they have. They supported Daley's mother. She had one child when her husband was executed. They supported her, and there was a priest who wrote about seeing her at church frequently, and he never mentions the child. But Halligan had no children, no relations in the country. He may have had a cousin. There was something that I read once, that he was on his way to Maryland, a southern state, where he allegedly had a cousin that he was going to visit. I've looked for that. I did find at one time there was a Halligan in the South who was selling a slave, but I chose to prefer that wasn't any relationship to the guy I was lobbying for.
Understandably.
So I have a question. Do we know where exactly Dominic Daley and James Halligan came from originally?
We don't know. No, we don't know where they came from. We do know where they went. After the execution, they went down on Old South Street, where there was they were boiled Their flesh was boiled off their bodies, and burnt, and their bones were given to dogs to eat.
Oh my
Wow.
God.
It's pretty gruesome, but I'm not sure that it's different than what happened to other people who were executed by the government.
Shocking.
I think Sam has his hand up there.
Yeah, I did have a question. From listening to you, it didn't sound like there was any investigation other than the two men, Halligan and Daley. Like they did not consider any other possibilities. Who conducted an investigation like that?
There wasn't anything done on behalf of the defendants. At that time, it wasn't unusual for lawyers to be appointed towards the end, but it was the judge's responsibility to serve the rights and constitutional rights of the accused. And both those judges failed miserably in this particular case. But no, there was nothing done. One of the issues that was brought, Dominic Daley's mother filed an appeal or asked for that he not be executed, or son not be executed. And one of the things she pointed out was that they claimed that they had left on Tuesday morning, and that they walked the first 3 or 4 days, they walked 20 miles an hour, and then after that they walked 40 miles an hour, so to indicate that they were running after it took place. The mother in her thing said, we didn't find out until the trial that they were saying that he didn't leave till Wednesday afternoon. He didn't leave on Tuesday morning, he left on Wednesday afternoon, but we were not allowed to testify that. There was a law at the time that you could not testify if you had an interest in the outcome of the case. And they wouldn't let his mother testify that he had, who was there for the trial, that he had really left on Tuesday afternoon, not Wednesday morning. So that was, the government made a big issue out of that particular point. I didn't concentrate much on that because the real issue is the only thing that convicted him was the testimony of the 13-year-old boy who said he saw him with the horse. Without that, there's not enough for an arrest.
Wow.
Okay, we'd like to invite everyone to join us on 3/17/22 at 10:30 at what's called Hospital Hill, or where the monument is on Halligan and Daley. Rain, shine, snow, it doesn't matter. The Sheriff's Department, even as I said, they cleared off. One year they even shoveled the path for us.
Yeah.
So everybody is invited, and thank you all for the questions and listening.
Yeah, and that'll be really, it will be Ruth Ryan who will be, what's the job of the?
Oh, they carry the wreath.
Who will carry the wreath. And Ruth is named for the Supreme Judicial Court judge who died a year ago.
Wow. All right. So we just call on Tim to thank you formally and to close the proceedings. Tim, over to you.
Okay, well, this was pretty interesting. A lot of story I'd never heard, even though I've been to the memorial. I certainly wasn't aware of the very, very lengthy backstory and the horrible outcome just all the way around of such a horrific event. And obviously it has resounded down through the generations to now, when it's still being recognized as a really horrific event, not only for the Valley, but for what it's testifies as the kind of immigration policies and the thoughts of local people were. I'm kind of struck by what Mike and Bill were saying, that 15,000 people came to watch the execution and only one Catholic priest was speaking for them. And I have read a little bit of how he was reprimanding the people that were there, especially the women, for coming and watching such a thing. And how could you do such a thing? It's really very, very ghastly, very ghastly. But in any case, Bill and Mike, we thank you very much for taking the time to share this all with us. We appreciate it. And congratulations again on your reward. And before we end, I'd like to thank again Alicia Moore, Consul General of Boston, for taking the time out of what I'm sure is still a very busy day, out of her schedule, for being with us once more to help us with this award ceremony. So thank you, Alicia, for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And so that ends our presentation. And again, look for it on YouTube in the next day or so. And we'll see you again in about a month. All right.
You got it.
So,
Thank you.
Slán a bháile.